Today, we are going to take another deep dive on the craziness that comes from Acts and Paul with regard to not obeying God's laws or commandments because they're too grievous to be borne. You can't handle it. It's too much. But when it comes to the laws of the rulers of the exousia, according to Romans 13, you better well obey them because they're ministers of God, he says. And by the way, if you don't attain or attend to their ordinances and their laws, you risk damnation. That's what it says in Romans 13, which Paul wrote to the Romans, saying you need to obey people in the form of Caesars who thought they were gods. And during the same time that Nero was in power, the letter to the Romans was written, or he had just was about to take power, or he had just taken power. And by the way, within 5 to 10 years, he burned Christians on crosses in the Roman Colosseum, and he blamed them for the burning of Rome, as if they did that, where most people think Nero did it himself, and he fed them to the lions. But if you actually attended to the law of God given through Moses and also spoken, the commandments spoken from the mount by God's own mouth to the people, Exodus 20, they didn't even teach the Gentiles about that, according to Acts and according to Romans. Paul made his own laws, many laws of which actually lined up with some of the laws in the Torah. But yet and still, they called it a yoke, troublesome. We will not trouble the Gentiles with God's law. We will make them attend to their own laws. And then you know what else Paul will tell them? You can go ahead and go into your idol temples and eat things sacrificed to them. And you wonder why I get so animated. When you realize what's happening in this Bible in which we've had tares sown in with wheat, as given to us from the church at Rome, you know, at least we still have the truth of what Jesus taught in there and also what the Torah and the prophets have said. And we can follow that, and we have to be able to rightfully discern what's right and wrong, even within this book that the Catholics gave us. So now we'll turn our attention back to the tares that Paul sowed. Romans 13, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. So that word there, higher powers, is exousia, as I referred to. It's a Greek word for basically authorities. And it could be authorities in a secular sense, in a religious sense, in a governmental sense. So now he goes on, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Okay, now let's just go back and talk about what Jesus called Satan, the prince of this world, 3 times in the book of John. So Jesus acknowledged many times that Satan is a fallen angel, and there are demonic entities and malevolent entities, and that they're the rulers of this world. As far as the leadership goes, that's not in alignment with Jesus Christ. Jesus said, you're either for me or against me. So now, again, and I'm going to show you a lot of backup on this. He's writing here to the Romans, who, as I said before, had been subjected to over a century of the Roman Caesars saying that they themselves were gods, who had temples made to themselves and statues and graven images of themselves made. If it didn't happen in their lives, their own lives, it happened after their deaths, that they were honored as gods. Everything I'm saying to you is easy to prove out with your Encyclopedia Britannica or your Funk and Wagnalls. So he says, the powers that be are ordained of God. So having said what I said about Satan being the prince of the power of the air and demonic rulership being under him, not to mention Satan was given even the authority to offer Jesus all the kingdoms of the world during his desert temptation. How could he do that if he didn't have the authority to do so? Jesus did not argue with him as to whether or not Satan could give him those kingdoms. He just said he wasn't going to worship Satan. As far as secular leadership goes, they've been allowed to be in power because of what? The sins of the people. Doesn't mean God ordained it. It means A plus B equals C in the algorithm of if you're a sinful nation, you're going to get what you deserve. And that's what that comes down to. He goes on, verse 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. So if you resist the laws of these countries, like for a long time in our country and still in many states, there's a law to abort babies if that allows for that. So if you resist that, am I resisting the ordinance of God then? Or any other evil law? All these laws that have been set up around stealing children from parents and the family courts. Am I resisting God then? Is that God's doing? This is all absurd, especially to a nation that had the evils of what went on with those Roman Caesars and the idolatry and the worship of Venus and Mars and other gods that they worshiped. This was completely a demonic empire, as all the ones had been before, by the way. He goes, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Okay. So this cat that's gotten you, telling you it's a yoke of bondage to obey God's law, is now telling you that the so-called ordinances that come from the exousia are ordinances that come from God through them that you've got to obey. Now, do you see how this kind of writing can set you up to be in bondage to demonic rulership and cause you to ignore and disobey and break God's commandments and completely disrespect the Father, disrespect God who went to so much trouble to get us the Torah and to get us his word. So much trouble he went to. He spoke again to the people from Mount Sinai, and they heard his voice, and they told Moses, man, you tell us from now on. We don't want to hear him anymore. That scared the socks off of me. And God went to all of that trouble to give his high holy standard to us. And if we keep that, we're in a yoke of bondage. But if we don't keep the ordinances that come through these exousia, then we're going to receive damnation. It's completely the opposite of the truth. If you don't obey God's commandments and find Jesus Christ and receive what he did for you and become an obedient servant to him, you are going to receive damnation for that. You're going to stand before God at your great white throne judgment, and that's when you receive your judgment. For how you line up with what Jesus taught. If you love me, keep my commandments, he said. And I'll send you a comforter. The only way to get the Holy Ghost is to keep the commandments. And keeping the commandments, suddenly your eyes will open and you'll have discernment. You'll have wisdom of people much older than you because you keep the commandments. And now he's saying that the commandments that come through these so-called higher powers, the exousia, are more important than God the Father's commandments. And this was supposedly someone that grew up studying and reading the Torah at the feet of Gamaliel, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. Well, he's acting like a Pharisee because he did just what Jesus accused the Pharisees of. He made the traditions of men exalted and raised on high, and has threatened you with damnation if you don't honor them. Whereas if you honor, he's made it you a legalist. If you honor what God asks, if you keep the Sabbath on the seventh day when God said the seventh day twice in the fourth commandment, if you honor that day, you're a legalist. Do you see how everything's up is down, black is white? Do you see the reversal? This is the epitome of Satanism and Masonry. It's all an inversion. It's the opposite of what God's taught. And if Satan can get everybody doing the opposite of what God teaches, to obey the traditions of men, the teachings of men, the ordinances of men, the commandments of men, the laws of men, the statutes of men, rather than the ordinances, commandments, and statutes of God, then he's going to grease the skids for all the people doing the opposite of what they should be doing to go straight to hell. So now let's see the inversion really take hold when we actually see what Jesus had to say about the authorities and the exousia, the powers that be, whether they were rulers or religious leaders. So this is Jesus talking. He charged them, that his disciples, saying, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So he's saying the doctrines and the teachings of the Pharisees and Herod, who was the client king of Israel, who reported to Rome. So he's telling you to beware the exousia, but Paul is telling you to fear them as if they are God's emissaries, and if you don't do what they say, you're damned. But Jesus is warning you instead to beware of these type people. He also says, beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth forth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. So Jesus is warning us about leadership and about people, his whole ministry. And again, Paul's saying, if you do good, then the powers that be will do good to you. Jesus Christ himself never did a wrong thing, and he was crucified by the leadership of this world, both religious and secular authorities. No one's really secular, but they're all religious, but they crucified the most perfect man that ever lived. Time after time, people are punished for doing good. Joseph would not allow Potiphar's wife to seduce him, And then she falsely accused him of rape and he got thrown in prison for doing the right thing. So just stop with that. What Paul is writing here in Romans 13, absolute and utter nonsense. He goes, for he is, speaking of the exousia, the powers, for he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. He is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. How many people have been into family courts where the powers, the so-called judges in those courts, have done exactly opposite of what needed to happen and rewarded the narcissist Jezebel who's lying on the other person, rewarded their evil, and punished the person that's doing good? I mean, the person that's writing this is literally acting like they live in some other universe. It's just absolutely ridiculous. He goes on, wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For he's saying, you be subject unto them. So now, I want you to really parse this down with me. He is telling you to be subject unto them, but it's too much trouble to be subject unto God the Father's laws, statutes, and ordinances. It's too much trouble for you to read the law of Moses when in the First Testament, they were supposed to read it every year at one of the feasts anyway, out loud. And God, throughout all of the First Testament, from Genesis to Malachi, established his likes and dislikes for our own good, his laws, statutes, and ordinances, his commandments, what we should be doing so that we would not suffer the repercussions of serving Satan and walking with him. And now this cat is telling them in Rome, of all places, going on, render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear. He's telling them to fear them when you should only fear God, by the way, not a man. Jesus said to fear not what man can do unto you. Jesus warned us that we'd be thrown into prison for his sake and that we'd be persecuted for his sake. So he's saying that the powers that be will never persecute you if you just do good, which is baloney. And then he says, basically tells you to bow and genuflect before them, these evil, wicked servants of Satan, finishing with honor to whom honor is due, basically. But he hates God's law. He hates it.